Good morning to everybody, and welcome to this session this morning that is going to be focused on managing marine resources and assets. I'm Dr. Leo Brewster. I'm the moderator for this session. And with me, I have Mr. Simeone Landucci. Simeone is an urban planner and a GIS specialist based in Rome, Italy. Simeone completed his MSc in urban and regional planning at Cardiff University and MSc in spatial planning at the European Environmental Policy at Nijmegen University. He recently specialized in geospatial science and GIS technology at Rome University. Simeone has 5 years of experience in the field of urban and regional planning with a focus on the application of GIS technologies to planning practices. With OpenPlan and other partners, Simeone has worked in Antigua and Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, Haiti, Jamaica, St. Lucia, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Trinidad and Tobago, and the United Kingdom. In addition, in person, we have Mr. Steve Kemp. And Steve is a spatial planner who specializes in plan making and placemaking. He first studied geography and sociology at the University of Hull, England, gaining a BA honors, and then went on to Nottingham Trent University, where he gained a postgraduate diploma in town and country planning. Steve has over 40 years professional experience in the UK and internationally, and has been working regularly in the Caribbean region since 2005. Steve's professional passions include community-led planning, planning for resilience and future generations, and planning places to support their community's well-being. Steve founded the specialist plan making and placemaking practice, OpenPlan, in 2014. He is also an active member of the RTPI, which is the Royal Town Planning Institute, and serves on several of the Institute's committees. In addition, online joining us is Mr. Otis Roberts. Otis is an urban and regional planner and a physical planning consultant who holds a Master of Science degree in urban and rural environmental management from the University of the West Indies, Mona, and a Bachelor of Science in urban regional planning from the University of Technology in Jamaica. Mr. Roberts has been employed to the ministry with responsibility for housing, presently the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, Jamaica, for 15 years in the field of policy development and research. He is presently the director of the Housing Policy and Research section. He has been one of the lead players since inception in the development of Jamaica's National Housing Policy and Implementation Plan. Mr. Roberts has also been integral in the review of Jamaica's Rent Restriction Act and the Housing Public-Private Partnership Joint Venture Policy. As an urban planner, Mr. Roberts works with an environmental consultancy firm informing environmental impact assessments through the understanding of socio-economic perception, land use, and other surveys. Through volunteerism, he oversees the ministry's program for engagement and training of unattached youth, which is referenced to as HOPE. Additionally, he volunteers as a mentor at Rio Cobre Juvenile Facility, mentoring wards of the state. He enjoys playing football, listening to music, and cross-country trips. I welcome all of our panelists this morning. I think that what we will do is we will start this session looking at the inherent ills associated with the shelter challenge or crisis, settlement along the Hope River watershed, Kingston and St. Andrew, Jamaica. And I'll hand it over now to Otis so that he can make his presentation. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Chair. Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning also to my fellow panelists. My presentation today, first I must say thank you for this opportunity to present today. And my presentation, as mentioned earlier, is going to look at the inherent ills associated with the shelter challenge And some persons might say this is actually a crisis. You can determine if it's a challenge or a crisis at the end of my presentation. And I'll be looking at settlement along the Oak River watershed in Kingston and St. Andrew. I'm sorry about that. I'm trying to move the slides, but it is not moving. I apologize. So my presentation today will look at the right to adequate housing and Jamaica's recognition of the right to adequate housing, the importance of housing, what is defined as adequate housing, and I'll be presenting some population demographics and housing need, and also the housing challenge. I will also look at the importance of watersheds, and I will zoom into the Oak River watershed and its degradation. And I will also present a case study of the impact of Tropical Storm Gustav on communities within the Oak River watershed. And I'll be looking at some policies and legislation as it relates to the protection of watersheds. So many of us might be aware that Article 25, subsection 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, states that everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, housing, and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to adequate security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. This is a very overarching and significant statement, or universal right, I should say. And oftentimes it's debated whether or not this connotes that everyone has the right to housing, and if governments are obligated to provide housing for all, or is it that governments are obligated to provide access to housing or opportunity to housing. And there are also other treaties, for example, the 1966 International Convention on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, which looks at housing. And in the Republic of South Africa, they have enshrined in their constitution the right, this right to housing, while Finland has made it mandatory for local government authorities to provide resources for severely handicapped under certain circumstances. In terms of Jamaica's recognition of the right to adequate housing, we have sought to ratify this convention by means of the following. In 1982, a draft national housing policy was prepared. This housing policy was approved as a green paper, but it was not promulgated. And thereafter, in 1987, there was a national shelter sector strategy, which sought to address the country's housing challenge through the provision of adequate housing for its populace. Just to note, the National Shelter Sector Strategy of 1987 pretty much identified all the issues that the 1982 housing policy identified. And there wasn't much significant change, positive change as it relates to provision of housing, adequate housing for all, even over that 5-year period. More recently, we have sought to prepare a new national housing policy and implementation plan. This policy and implementation plan is more advanced than the 82 policy in that it was approved in 2019 as a green paper and also tabled in the Houses of Parliament. And presently we are about to seek Cabinet's approval to table this policy as a white paper in the Houses of Parliament. And this is the final stage of the policy development process in Jamaica. Many persons will debate the importance of housing, and sometimes there are misconceptions about the importance of housing. But I will start by quoting John Turner in his housing law number 2. He states that the important thing about housing is not what it is. It's not what housing is. The important thing is what housing does in people's lives. It does a lot in people's life, especially when you have legal access and access to a title. It unlocks economic and social potential. So housing is more than just 4 walls and a roof over someone's head. Housing is fundamental to people's economic and social well-being. It unlocks opportunity, as I mentioned earlier. And having access to housing is only one side of the coin. The other side of the coin, which I think is more important, is having access to adequate housing. And what do I mean by adequate housing? Adequate housing means living in structurally sound units, having security of tenure, not living in overcrowded solutions, and we use the international standard of less than or equal to 1.01 persons per habitable room. It also means adequate privacy. It means physical accessibility. It means security, access to proper physical and physical infrastructure and social amenities. And importantly, maybe most importantly to me is affordability, because much of the problem that we face now in Jamaica relates to the issue of affordability. And affordability is defined as someone spending 30% or less of their gross income on housing. And just to point out, most of the solutions that we are presently providing here in Jamaica does not necessarily cater for the low income to middle income groups. They are more the upper middle income to high income groups. And we have sought to use various initiatives to cater for the low income groups through joint venture partnerships with private sector entities, and also social housing program, housing for the indigent. Just to give some general statistics, Jamaica's population stood at 2.6 plus million persons based on the 2011 census. We were due to do a census in 2022, 2021, but based on COVID, we were unable to do such a census. And we are presently seeking to embark on this census to get more recent information. But in 2011, there were 881,070 households occupying 853,661 private dwellings, which amounted to an average of 334 dwellings per 1,000 persons. There were 671,331 housing units, and the average household size was 3.1. And the population is projected to reach over 2.9 million persons by 2030. Housing projections done by the ministry with responsibility for housing in 2004 revealed that for the period 2001 to 2025, we need 13,260 units per year. But more recent surveys conducted to inform the new housing policy indicated that based on population dynamics, we now need 15,000 units per year between 2010 to 2030. And I must point out that the average number of units being built annually amounts to 11,152 units annually. And given that there is a housing need of 15,000, our calculation indicates a shortfall of 3,848 units. And additionally, there is an estimated 2,400 units in need of replacement each year. This replacement is due to the fact that some of these solutions are inadequate based on international and local standards. And also, even though the squatter population and the provision of squatter solutions is solving some problem, and some persons might have issues with I saying this, but it is indeed an opportunity. It is indeed a means of denting the housing crisis or providing housing solutions. But there are units being produced in that sector that are inadequate. So this results in a backlog, not in terms of deficit, not in terms of number of solutions, but adequacy. So when we compute everything, the total annual deficit amounts to 6,248 units. And because of the failure to provide housing, adequate and sufficient housing, persons have resorted to squatting. And this, much of the squatting is taking place in environmental sensitive areas, including watersheds. Based on a 2008 rapid assessment of squatting in Jamaica, 20% of the country's population resided in squatter settlements. But when the censuses are conducted, the number reported for squatting is always less significant than 20%. It's sometimes even as low as 1% or 2%. This is because the censuses, when censuses are being done, persons are asked pretty much, what is your tenure? And persons will be hesitant to say that they are informal settler or quote unquote squatter. But the 2008 survey was done using a methodology where we did the surveys of the communities, the socioeconomic surveys, but at the same time, we use land information in terms of ownership information to ascertain if these persons surveyed on this parcel of land are squatters, do they own the land or not? So we use that type of land ownership information to ascertain if they are informal settlers. 24% of the squatter settlements are actually located within 100 meters of waterways. And this is of significant concern because 20% being located in 100 meters of waterways amount to basically 0.1 kilometers. So 24% of the squatter settlements are located in 0.1 kilometer of a waterway. I find this to be really, really significant and something that needs to be addressed because these persons are vulnerable based on their location to various hazards. And not only that, their activities impact the environment negatively in terms of their solid waste practices and other things. It impacts the environment negatively. And it is evident that many of our watersheds suffer as people seek to provide housing for themselves. And we are a nation, generally we are people who, if we have a need and the need is not being satisfied or satisfied adequately, then we are going to find a solution for ourselves because we are resilient persons and we will go and do what we need to do. So I think that intervention is needed immediately. It is a case of urgency to address this housing problem or challenge or crisis that we face here in Jamaica. I don't think I need to go into what is a watershed. Most of us know what a watershed is, or I think all of us would know. But just to say that it's a geographical area through which water flows across the land and drains into a common body of water, whether a stream, lake, or ocean. And we know the services that are provided by watersheds or healthy watershed ecosystem services, including nutrient cycling, carbon storage via carbon sink, increased biodiversity, soil formation, water storage and water filtration, flood control. It provides food, timber, and recreation. It also reduces vulnerability to invasive species and the effects of climate change and natural disasters. Indeed, there's a direct correlation between the services provided by watersheds and our social, environmental, and economic well-being. Many persons, I think, will readily relate to the environmental concerns associated with the unfriendly and friendly practices within our watersheds. They will relate to the environmental concerns in terms of persons dumping garbages in the watershed or in the rivers, or maybe their susceptibility and vulnerability. But I don't think many persons readily relate to the inseparable economic and social issues, even as it relates to the impact on their family, on livelihoods and stuff like that, and even security concerns also. So this here is the Hope River watershed. If you look, the Hope River watershed falls within the parishes of St. Andrew and Kingston. And here is a detailed depiction of the Hope River watershed, supported by the various tributaries and the Hope River. And you can see it spans from St. Andrew down into Kingston. It is one of our most significant watersheds. And in terms of vulnerability, there are issues relating to vulnerability within this watershed area. So the Hope River watershed is an extremely fragile ecosystem that supports 1/3 of Jamaica's population. The Hope River watershed, the Hope River itself and its tributaries supply water for a variety of purposes to the capital city of Kingston primarily via the Mona Reservoir. And this is just a picture that I captured while doing some work within the Hope River watershed in 2008. It shows a section of the Hope River watershed, and you can see here this mountain ridge. I think it is referred to as the Dallas Mountain. And further down the Hope River watershed and the lower watershed, there is also a mountain range on the opposite side. So the watershed in the lower area runs through both mountain ranges, the Dallas Mountain Range and the Long Mountain Range. This building you're seeing here, first, this road you're seeing here, this bridge, is actually a bridge that leads to a community called Kintyre. And it also leads to from Kintyre to Tavern and the Papine area. Prior to this bridge being constructed, boulders from the river were basically dumped and compact with sediments from the river to actually create a makeshift bridge. But time over time, that got washed away, and they eventually constructed this bridge that you're seeing here. This housing unit here actually collapsed during the passage of Tropical Storm Gustav. And again, this is also a section of the Hope River watershed, and this is a footbridge that spans from the community of Tavern to this side, Papine, to Kintyre on the next side. And as you can see here, garbage is dumped within the watershed. Excuse me. There are many factors that have contributed to the degradation of the Hope River watershed, including farming practices, including overcultivation on steep slopes, mainly for Blue Mountain, for the production of Blue Mountain coffee, coffee for Blue Mountain coffee. And this occurs mainly in the upper watershed areas in communities like Gordon Town, Highlight View, Mavis Bank, and Irish Town. There has also been the indiscriminate and large-scale removal of trees, illegal mining, unapproved and informal quarrying, housing developments, including formal housing developments, and also squatter settlements, water pollution associated with the use of agrochemicals in farming activities, improper disposal of solid and liquid waste. These activities have led to significant water loss, not only in quantity, but also in quality of the water. This is also a picture captured in 2008 by myself. Within the Hope River watershed, you can see here housing units, and some of these units are 2-story units within the community of Kintyre. And you can see here the garbage disposal practices, unfriendly garbage disposal practices. And this is also a section of the watershed. And you can see here the housing units perched on a steep slope within close to the Hope River. Persons will tell you that back in years ago, this was not the situation, but over time, the slopes got eroded by water flowing through the river channel, and now it places them in a precarious situation. Just to point out, this section, this is actually the section where the footbridge was noted earlier. I also looked at a study done in 2000 by Iman, which looked at the degradation of the Hope River watershed, and it revealed that since the 1980s, water supply to the Mona Reservoir has been supplemented by the Yalas River, which actually falls in a adjacent watershed area, and this is because of the reduction in the quantity of and quality of water supplied by the Hope River. And it also revealed, the study also revealed that the cultivation of coffee on steep slopes within the watershed has led to reduced availability of water, deteriorating conditions due to erosion, deforestation, and degrading water quality. The Hope River and its tributaries have deteriorated not only in spatial context, but temporal dimensions, and nutrient levels have increased. Fecal coliform levels have exceeded the maximum allowable limits for health and recreational use over 90% of the time. Nitrate, phosphate, and fecal coliform levels tend to increase downstream towards the Harbor View area, which is located in the lower level of the watershed, which actually empties into the sea. Based on the said study, a GIS-based evaluation of land use dynamics in the Hope River upper watershed area showed that, and this is where most of the coffee cultivation takes place, the upper level, showed that between 1989 and 1998, agriculture increased by 55% from 737 to 1,144 hectares. Settlements increased by 23.6% from 55 to 68 hectares, and forests decreased by 18.2%. The increase in land usage and decrease in forests were mainly attributed to the conversion of land into coffee based on demand for Blue Mountain coffee internationally. This is not to say that you guys should not purchase Blue Mountain coffee, because it is good. If you haven't tried it, I think you should try it. I recommend so. The relationship between land use and water shows that stream flow has increased as a result of a decline in forests due to agriculture expansion. I will now delve into the case study on the impact of Tropical Storm Gustav in 2018.
Hi, Otis. Sorry
Yes.
to interrupt, but time is running, and I need to ensure that you can be summing up very quickly, because
Yes.
the other presenters also have to be given a chance. Thanks.
Oh, okay. So a total of 248 families comprising of 66 individuals were impacted by Tropical Storm Gustav, and these persons resided in Kingston and St. Andrew within the Hope River watershed area. And persons lost their lives as a result of the passage of Tropical Storm Gustav based on how precarious they were along the banks of the Hope River. And the impact was far-reaching. It affected the young and the old. So this is showing a picture of the impact during the passage of Tropical Storm Gustav. This house right here as you can see, the wall collapsed and many others are on the verge of collapsing. This building here also, which was a church. And this building I showed earlier collapsed right at the bridge, the vicinity of the bridge. These structures collapsed also. In terms of protection of watershed, the 1960s was an important period as it relates to the protection of watersheds in Jamaica. There was a 1963 Watershed Protection Act, which empowers the minister to declare watershed areas and to ensure their protection. And there was also the promulgation of the National Resources Conservation Authority Act in 1991, which seeks, which created a watershed protection management branch within NEPA. And there is also other related provisions that the National Land Policy, the Forest Policy, policy for Jamaica System of Protected Areas, the Water Sector Policy, which actually speaks to the protection of watershed areas. And the way forward is to, for us to provide sufficient, safe, and affordable housing, for us to embark on natural resource valuation by means of putting monetary value on our ecosystems. And many persons don't readily relate to this, that the ecosystem has a value, and we need to quantify this and also protect this, the services. And there's also the need to improve resource protection and conservation practices, and also sustainable land use management systems. Thank you very much for your time. These are some references that I used, and I'm open for questions. Once again, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Otis. Given our time constraint at this point, I think I would like to also move forward to allow Simeone and Steve to make their presentation, and then we'll do all the questions at the end of the session. Thanks a lot.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you and welcome. I am Simone Landucci, Urban Planner JS Specialist at Open Plan. And this is Steve Kemp, Executive Director at Open Plan. Today, we will talk about use of coastal vulnerability modeling in spatial planning and coastal management. And we will look at a specific model, the INVEST Coastal Vulnerability Model developed by Stanford University as part of the Natural Capital Project. We're going to look what the model is, how it works, how you can use its results in the plan making process and integrated coastal management process. And we will have a quick look of how we have used it as part of a particular project that we've been involved in. So the spatial focus of the model are coastal areas. Coastal areas are important in the Caribbean because they are relevant to small island developing states, because they are the location where majority of productive economic areas and social and cultural activities happens. Majority of the biggest cities are located in coastal areas, as well as very important ecosystem, such as mangroves, coral reef, seagrass beds, etc. Now, in the presentation given earlier by Otis Brewster, he mentioned the role of ecosystem services, and we will touch upon that because that's a key element in the model we're going to use at. You're going to look at. The coastal areas are also threatened by climate change in a considerable way and in a disproportionate manner compared to other parts of our countries. So the models look at two particular hazards that affect coastal areas: coastal flooding and coastal erosion. There are two different type of hazard. They occur in very different time span. Coastal erosion is a longer process and continuous process, where coastal flooding is an extreme event that happens in a very localized time. But they are exacerbated by climate change. So the impact of climate change on coastal areas is twofold. There is a direct impact, meaning that sea level rise, hurricanes, sea surges, storm leads to loss of lives, but also loss of property and therefore loss of livelihoods, reduction of habitable land in terms of erosion, etc. But there is also an indirect impact. So climate change related events and hazards such as droughts, ocean acidification, heat waves, marine heat waves, and ocean warming leads to loss of ecosystem and loss of biodiversity. And loss of ecosystem and loss of biodiversity impact our ecosystem and reduces the ecosystem services these environments provide. So when we look at coastal forests, when we look at mangrove forests, coral reef, seagrass bed, and our bottom algae, what we are looking at in the context of this model are the ecosystem services they provide. Coral reef and mangroves break down the energy of incoming waves. They sediment the soil and provide stabilization, so avoiding erosion and preserving the land where our structure are built. And they provide a series of other ecosystem services, of course, such as being nursing areas for fish that we eventually fish and consume as food. But in this particular model, we're looking at them in terms of these two key aspects: reduction of wave energy and wind energy as well, and soil retention and stabilization. So in the conceptualization of vulnerability, because the model is a vulnerability assessment, we need to consider two different aspects: the hazard, and we have discussed the hazard a bit in the previous slides, but also the element at risk. To be at risk, there should be an hazard, so on a probability that a nefarious event would occur and someone that will be impacted by that event. And these, in our situation, are people, residential properties, livelihoods, economic activities, but also historic and cultural assets. Coastal areas host in Caribbean, in small island developing states, host most of these elements at risk. And we now have all the elements to define vulnerability. So give a conceptual framework for our model. So as any model, before going into the nitty-gritty quantitative part of how you combine different variables, you need to start with a conceptual framework that gives you all the elements and how you conceptualize them. So within the INVEST model, vulnerability is defined as exposure plus resistance plus resilience. Exposure is the exposure to the hazard. So how the element at risk falls within the spatial overlay of an hazard footprint. So they are in a flood risk area. They are on the path of an hurricane. Resistance is a specific characteristic of the element at risk, is the capacity of the instruments and solutions that are in place to prevent, avoid, or reduce losses. And those include, for example, structure, reinforced structure in buildings, etc. Resilience is the capacity of the element at risk to recover after a damage has occurred. So vulnerability is reduced by resistance, and so the higher the resistance, the lower the vulnerability, the higher the resilience, the lower the vulnerability, and obviously the more exposed you are, the lower your vulnerability. So what is the INVEST model and how does it work? As I mentioned before, INVEST is a free and open source, spatially explicit model developed by Stanford University. Is not the INVEST coastal vulnerability model is only one of the models that are offered as part of the Natural Capital Project. When I say that they're free and open source, I mean that you don't need to pay to use them, which is an interesting feature for almost anything, but they're also open source. It means that if you want to get your hands dirty in the coding, you can improve and amend and tailor-made the model to your own needs. And INVEST have a number of different tools to deal with ecosystem service valuation, natural resource valuation, as Otis was mentioning earlier, and generally how to include natural and ecosystem services into the decision-making process. Another interesting INVEST tool, for example, is the marine habitat valuation tool. So how does this particular one works? So the way it operates is that you start by defining a model resolution. You get your coastline and you split it into the different sections for which you will make an assessment. In the example there are 250 meters in length, but depending on the quality of the data you want, depending on the scale of your analysis, you might want to have different length. You may be prone to go for this lowest length possible, 1 meter, but that increases computation time considerably. So you need to strike a balance there. The models take a number of input data, which are 6. Geomorphology, presence of habitats, and here is where the models includes and consider ecosystem services and trying to quantify that. Relief, and also climate change related data, wind exposure, wave exposure, and surge potential. For each of them, he creates a variable rank and then brings all those 6 elements to synthesis. And what he outputs for you is the EI, the exposure index, for each of the section of the coast you were interested in. So the exposure index that you see on the right-hand side, it will give you a value for each of the little pieces of the shoreline that you have identified. It is, as any other invest model, is spatially explicit. So what it comes out of it is an actual map, which makes it easier to understand, easy to use in a plan making process, as we will see in the next slide. If you remember the slide we saw earlier, exposure were only a component of vulnerability. We need to combine this with the element at risk. So when you do the cost of vulnerability analysis, you can combine the spatial information you have with other spatial information you may get, where people live, where infrastructure are located, what's the value of different properties along the coast. And you can even go into more detail instead of looking at where population lives, where the elderly live, because you assume that the elderly are more vulnerable than other people, where people at the lower brackets of your income distribution lives, where informal communities are, and so on and so forth. What the model outputs is something like this. So this is an example from Freeport, Grand Bahama. As we will see later on, we apply this methodology to 6 different countries: Haiti, Jamaica, Dominica, San Vincent and the Grenadine, and St. Lucia. But the example here is from Freeport, Grand Bahama. The reason of that is that when you download the invest models, it comes with a series of sample data set for you to play with. And the sample data set they provide you are from Freeport, Grand Bahama. So I wanted to show you some representation of that to encourage you also to visit their website, download the tool, play with it. There are really good user guidelines. The interface is quite helpful and useful, and there is an interesting community to help you in case you have problems. So what does the models output at the end? Here you have the different section of the coastline, which are graded and given a value, which is the exposure index that ranges from 1, which is low exposure, to 5, which is high exposure. In the map, they're color-coded, having the hotter color for the very high exposure and greener, colder colors for the very low exposure. So you immediately get a vision of where the problems might be. So you start to understand which part of your coast is more exposed compared to others. And if you add to that information on where population live, you could either discount some parts that have not particularly at risk because they are exposed, but no one lives there. Or you could identify areas that are moderately exposed, but a lot of people live there. So there's areas where you want to plan for. How does the model does that? So it takes a series of inputs. The first one is the geomorphology. You need to differentiate your coast according to the typology of lands that is there, such as rock, mud, sand, and provide each typology with a rank, which is 1, high protection, and 5, low protection. This is one of the most difficult input to get. We could discuss later if there are questions of where you can get this data from, because a lot of them are available open source, or you can build them from remote sensing. This one is a difficult one to get from remote sensing information, but it's feasible to do it. You need a bathymetry data and a DEM, a digital elevation model. Those are used to define the relief rank. Higher areas above the coastline are more protected because of where they are, but also the wind and wave exposure bathymetry is a component in the height of the waves you will get on the coastline. So the models considered that as well. Again, them are simple to get. LiDAR data are available for most of the coastline you want. Well, for some of the coastline you want, but definitely online, remote sensing generated. The digital elevation models are available free for download. Bathymetry is more complex. You might get it for free or open source, but not to the resolution you might need. So that, for example, in the program we were working on was a problem. The habitat input. This is probably the most interesting part of the model. The models takes into account what kind of habitat is and where. So if a specific tract of coast is fronted by a coral reef and a mangrove forest, their areas will be more protected than somewhere else. And that will reflect in the exposure index value at the end. When the model does that, that means that you could run different scenarios. You could run a scenario where that coral reef is lost, or that mangrove forest has been reduced by 20, 30%, and see how that changed the exposure index. The model takes other information that are be more difficult to show spatially, but they are average wind speed and wave height and wave energy in different parts of the ocean, which again is an interesting aspect of the model because it means that it takes into account climate change, and you could feed the model different climate change projections, both in terms of wind speed, wave energy, but also sea level rise, and see how your coast or the exposure index of your coastline will behave under different assumptions, and you can compare. So what kind of results you get? We showed earlier the maps. This is just the map of before with overlaid with different habitat scenarios. The first and simplest things you can realize is trying to understand if your habitats are doing something to protect your coastline. In the Grand Bahama, in the Freeport example here, from this map, I assume that the coral reef you see on the western side is protecting the coastline, which in fact gets a very low exposure index. So you could run the same analysis without that coral reef and see if actually that provides any information. And you can run the no habitat scenarios, for example. So you assume that all the habitats you saw before was lost. And we can see on the west coast here some changes. So areas that were very well, very low exposure or low exposure, getting to moderate or high exposure because of the loss of that ecosystem. This is a very extreme scenario, like no habitat is present. It's more for understanding how the role of the habitats, which you can also visualize here. So you can look at areas where the habitat protection provides the highest level of contribution. But you can design scenarios that are a bit more detailed in terms of where you have lost what in terms of habitats. We mentioned earlier that you need to overlap this with population information on your element at risk. This is an example here. The red elements that you see there are density, population density in Freeport. So you can identify which areas on the coast is most populated. And you can even obviously design your methodology to put a threshold. So areas that are in the highest quintile in terms of density and that are in either high or moderate or very high exposure areas will be my target for more further in-depth studies. So overall, the model can be used to test different scenarios in terms of green and gray infrastructure. When I say green infrastructure, I mean the habitats, so the presence of absence of habitats. When I mean gray infrastructure, we need to remember that before we have used geomorphology and we're given high values, geomorphological values. So we have reduced exposure for areas that, for example, are fronted by a seawall or a revetment or groins. So you can model it, assuming that you have built a seawall there, or you have built a groin there, and see how that changes. You can run different climate scenarios, as we mentioned earlier. You generally can use this map to awareness raising. The fact that they're very visual, that what you get out of it is a map of places that people know, helps in vehiculating and presenting the problematics of erosion and flooding. And you can use results to inform land use planning. And Steve is going to tell us a bit more about that.
Thank you, Simone. Yes, yeah, very, very briefly, just to sort of go through some of the basic considerations in, I suppose, mostly local area planning. Is the area where there's the greatest capacity to take this into detailed account. Having gone through a process of modelling and analysing the vulnerability of different parts of the coastline, you are then faced with various choices, if you like, as a policymaker and as a planning policymaker. And in simple terms, the range of policies that you've got available to you run from the most extreme, which is to prohibit all development in a particular place, a particular area, through that's sort of graded through sort of restricting development. So certain types of development or a certain amount of development might be permissible in areas subject to certain conditions. You then sort of lift to supporting development in areas where vulnerability and risk is lowest. And you might then go on to the next levels, which would be to encourage development and to actually promote development in some cases. And the types of development that you are dealing with will be variously appropriate to these different areas. So for instance, if you have an area of very high risk, very high vulnerability that you are not able to mitigate, then the emphasis is going to be on prohibiting development or restricting development of types where the actual development itself, the use that's involved, would necessarily involve more people being placed at risk. So housing, for instance, is the obvious one. You wouldn't want to put more housing into an area of great risk. And you might, however, in an area of some risk, but not that high risk, want to have some other activities that might be useful for actually dealing with the outcomes of hazards when they happen, but you probably still wouldn't want to have housing there. So you want to ideally locate your housing in areas that have been assessed as being of the lowest possible risk. You can use, therefore, the model to develop an ideal situation and to develop strong policies. You're still stuck then with the next stage, which is to put those policies into practice. And just thinking back to some of the things that Otis Roberts was telling us about the Jamaica example, then clearly you then get into issues of political will, community support, resource availability, because if you're going to do more than just recognize the risk, if you're going to act to take people away from risk, you have to confront some fairly tricky issues that particularly in small island states are quite awkward ones sometimes for people to face up with. So again, just quickly going back to what Otis was saying, yeah, we've got a human right to a standard of living, which includes housing. He made the distinction between housing and adequate housing. Clearly, housing that's in such a vulnerable place that the occupants of the housing would be at significant risk isn't really adequate housing. So you've got to find ways to in political and legislative terms, to provide for taking people out of these areas, making sure new people aren't put into the areas of high risk, and concentrating on using the resources available to government and to everybody else to to gradually shift to lower risk scenarios. And that's really all I want to say on that.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Just to add to what you mentioned, the model can definitely help with all the different aspects that you were talking about, and we have identified it since it's a quantitative spatial scenario decision support tool, and it provides some robust, spatially explicit, easily implementable, and decision-making oriented solutions.
That's what it's a support tool. But
Absolutely.
It doesn't dictate. You've
No.
still got to make those, those difficult decisions.
Absolutely. And there's a reason why it's called a decision support rather than a decision-making tool. It's a model. It's a simplification of reality that it's meant to help you understand a particular piece of a complex system, rather than giving you all the answer you need or being 100% correct in everything. But it has some strengths. It's free and open source. It does consider account for climate change. The output map are easy to understand and communicate. It's intuitive and it's flexible. So just to close this presentation with a bit of information on how we have and why we have developed this application of the model. So it was part of the FRAME project investment plans for the Caribbean Regional Track, the pilot program for climate resiliency. And the consultancy was about training in and development of coastal scenarios for PPCR pilot countries. We were working in and with stakeholders from Jamaica, Haiti, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and Grenadine, and Grenada. And we were meant to develop a model that was able to generate and evaluate coastal scenarios, provide capacity building and training to local stakeholders, and inform planners and decision makers. What we eventually were able to achieve was providing over 9 hours of training to 80 plus stakeholders from the PPCR countries as well as other different Caribbean countries, develop the different manuals and methodological material to use and apply the results of the tool in land use planning and coastal integrated management. And you can see on the left-hand side a bit of a simplification of the different steps. So you define alternative scenarios, you assess exposure, you assess vulnerability, you make decision, you monitor, and you start again. And we also provided different stakeholders with input data set to generate their own vulnerability scenario for 3 locations, Jamaica, Haiti, and Dominica. So 3 out of the 6 PPCR countries. So that was our presentation. Thank you. And
thanks a lot, Simeone and Steve. At this point, I would just like to prepare to open the floor, but just give a quick recap as to what we heard from our presenters today. Under the Jamaica Shelter Challenge Crisis presentation, we realized that housing is of a relevant concern within the Jamaican situation, especially in the Hope watershed area. Access to adequate housing is significant, with affordability being 30% or less from gross income. And generally what we're finding under the housing situation is that it's being situated and generated for higher income groups, while lower income groups still get left somewhat behind in some of their approaches, being left to fend for themselves. In essence, on average, the government is providing 11,152 units being built annually, even though the real target is supposed to be around 15,000. And therefore, squatter populations are growing incrementally in some locations, especially in watersheds and environmentally sensitive areas. Of great concern, though, is the fact that a lot of these informal accommodations are being found within 100 meters of the watershed, which makes them fall within a full high hazard zone area, making them exceedingly vulnerable to hazards. And based on the pictorial presentation, we can see that things like erosion of riverbanks is causing a significant problem for some of these housings, As the banks erode, they obviously encroach onto properties, leading to some collapse, especially when rivers flood. More importantly, as the banks eventually will fail, and therefore ecosystem valuation for the protection of services is a great concern in the overall project proposal development aspects in the way forward as to what we're looking at. Under the coastal vulnerability modeling open plan program using the invest free software model, you can see that the emphasis is on coastal areas and the vulnerabilities that can be exposed there, with the example being provided that we looked at the evaluation of coastal erosion and coastal flooding as a hazard concern. You input the climate change considerations into coastal areas and focus on loss of potential ecosystems and biodiversity can obviously lead to a loss in ecosystem services in the long run. The vulnerability elements at risk are going to be the people, residential properties, livelihoods, economic activity, historical and cultural assets found along coastlines. And therefore, you have to look to develop maps that are visual and can be used to heighten awareness, building, and future planning scenarios. The outputs themselves are used in the active development planning phase, using clear options for consideration, and the output assets with policy formulation and consideration for enhancement and improved development planning can be achieved effectively. Obviously, bearing the political dimension will always carry the full weight of the final decision, and that the models themselves in all their formats are a quantitative spatial scenario decision support tool, with the emphasis being that it is a model decision support tool, and it can help us to better understand the practical pieces of complex systems using intuitive, flexible approaches in your assessment of any coastal space. They make it sound really easy, but the data component is obviously going to be the key driver there. I'm going to open the floor now for any questions. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to raise them. We don't have any questions from those online. So anybody in person here has any questions they want to raise? Thanks a lot.
Hi, good morning. Robin Rajak from the IDB. I just wanted to ask if you could maybe reference your examples, if from this particular study or maybe elsewhere, of to what extent has the use of visualizations like you have been able to produce helped to promote behavior change? A lot of what we're trying to accomplish to increase our resilience requires behavior change. And I wonder whether you're finding that these tools, their accessibility and the way in which they're able to communicate to us and to communities, are you being encouraged that it's actually helping to produce behavior change, or do we have some way to go still on that front?
Otis, I think that's also a question that you could respond to as well in terms of your own work.
I think it's a really good question. I think you answered it yourself at the end. I think we've still got a way to go. We had a discussion yesterday about how you bring the interests of future generations more clearly into the planning process. And this is a fairly immediate one. And one of the things we looked at was engagement of younger people in that process. And I think that's part of the issue. I think this type of modelling potentially becomes increasingly accessible to people and means more and more to people as you come down the age range. And so in terms of getting local understanding of these fairly complex issues, I think it's got huge potential as we move forward, but I don't think it's been realised yet. We were talking yesterday about almost taking a gaming approach to it so that people can start to really manipulate these things and see, well, what happens if this happens? And I think that's where it really comes alive. And I'm hoping that somehow we'll get there fairly quickly. But as I say, I think there's a way to go. I don't know what you think, Simone.
I personally think that it makes a change when you're dealing with different stakeholders rather than specifically with communities, because we are mostly use them in that context. So with during workshops, you can tell that a map prompts a conversation rather than just discussing of places in general terms. We, in a different project, the St. Vincent, the National Plan for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we even use ArcGIS as 3D mapping capacity, which in a rugged mountainous environment like St. Vincent, when you look at the map in 3D and you turn around and you pivot, it gives you an understanding of the conformation of the terrain and how that influence human and transportation dynamics a lot. So I think that was quite helpful.
And I think that is easily accessible to non-experts, to the general community as well, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's an impression. I mean, we never really did any surveys on that. For example, asking people, would have this been less clear without a map or something like that? So I do personally feel that people have at least shown an higher interest, and it prompts a more in-depth conversation, a more rooted conversation about what about this place, what about that place, how this place connect to that place, which is planning. So,
any more questions? Go ahead.
Good morning. Kim Penfold from the Barbados Town Planning Society. First of all, I say found both presentations this morning extremely interesting. But as a person with a long-standing involvement in social housing in different places for a long time, I've got a couple of points to ask Otis to comment on. And the first is really about how it's going to be possible to affect relocation of people from some of the informal settlements, where, judging from the pictures, they've clearly invested quite a lot of money, because the structures looked as if they were fairly solid lumps of masonry, which had effectively had their foundations taken away from them. So the first question is, how do you begin to get into negotiations with people about relocating to less vulnerable sites? And the second one is really linked to some of our needs in Barbados. I'm wondering to what extent you actually have a fully enforceable building control system for housing standards, to what extent that extends to people at the lower income range and smaller builders, how that works, and possibly linking on from that as well. We have a very, very large and vulnerable housing stock here, which needs some sort of retrofitting. I wonder if there are programs in place in Jamaica to actually prepare some of the older stock to withstand hurricane attacks in a way which they might not have been able to do previously. And I think that's advice on those issues is probably welcomed in a lot of places. Thank you.
Otis, if you would care to respond.
Yes, certainly so. Thank you very much for your questions. As it relates to the first question about how do we negotiate relocation, what we have done here in Jamaica is by means of the ministry with responsibility for housing, is that oftentimes we conduct surveys of squatter settlements. And when we visit these communities, we seek to garner socioeconomic information of these settlements, and we seek to sensitize persons more about their vulnerability. I think persons are becoming more aware of how vulnerable they are in light of climate change, and they see stuff happening more frequently, and they are becoming more susceptible daily. But there is this element of resistance, because while we try to sensitize these persons about their vulnerability and the need to embark on certain more environmental friendly practices, they have to choose between their economics. These are low-income persons, so they are forced to choose between providing for their basic needs or doing certain things that are more friendly to the environment. And what the government has been doing on a national level, though, is that we seek to regularize some of these settlements where feasible, but indeed some settlements or some individuals or households will have to be relocated, especially those significantly perched in areas susceptible to hazards. So it is impossible to relocate the entire community. So we will go on a case-by-case basis based on our survey. And we also put in practices like which can bolster them to withstand the environmental issues. For example, the installation of gabion baskets and otherwise. As it relates to the enforceability aspect of things, we have always had building standards, and the municipal corporation in granting development approval will use these standards to approve or to refuse approval for developments. So we have had these standards, but more recently, we have had a new building act, which basically now gives more teeth, so to speak, to the standards that we had before. And we are now in the process of seeking to fully enforce this new building act. I think the act was passed in 2018, but there are certain regulations that needs to be passed. And now we are moving to enforce this act in full effect. But we accept that there are informal settlers who fall outside of the remit of the formal system, and they are satisfying their needs. And while we seek to penalize these persons sometimes, we have to accept the reality of our situation in Jamaica and try to work with what is happening, because it's somewhat organic in a sense. So we try to work with it to some extent through regularization and otherwise. As it relates to program to bolster what is happening in these settlements, we have been having community sensitization sessions, and even at the national level, we sensitize persons about the impacts of climate change and the importance of preserving and protecting our environment, and how our activities impact the environment and how the environment impacts us. And as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, most persons will readily relate to the environmental impacts. And climate change is big on our agenda now as a country. I think more and more persons are understanding the impacts of climate change that we are facing now. So I think we are slowly changing, but I must point out again, I must reiterate that we are a low-income country, and sometimes it goes back to persons investing in their basic needs as opposed to changing their practices. I hope my comments answer your question.
Thanks a lot, Otis. I think they covered it off pretty well. The next question, please.
Hi, thank you for both of the presenters for interesting presentations. My name is Riina Haavisto, and I work for UN Women, so the United Nations Gender Equality Agency. So I was very curious about the social aspects of all these models and these approaches, and as well as the community work that we do, because we know that climate change obviously affects everyone, but not in the same way, and it can differ on the socioeconomic status and the gender and even religion and culture and so forth. So I'm curious to hear if you've encountered in your work any good practices, or how we can better acknowledge these differences between different people, and then also how to, especially when it comes to modeling with GIS, it's always the question of, we suffer of chronic data deficit of gender and sex and disability and so forth. But I would be curious to hear if you're seeing any good approaches how to deal with that kind of issue. Thank you.
Yeah, well, part of the problem is obviously in what you just mentioned, the fact that data collection seems to be blind to gender issues. So you design models that take accounts of gender dynamics, you will need specific data that talks about gender, something a bit more specific than the percentage of women on the population, which is something that a census will capture. But you may want something a bit more specific. You may want women in information on women in poverty, women that live alone, women that are single mothers, and so on and so forth. I think that when it comes to GIS, it's all about the conceptual framework that you design. So when you design a model like this, in this particular case, it was given to us. So in terms of what the definition of vulnerability is, but you can be very creative in designing a model that looks at the dynamics you want to explore. So you never start with the model. You start with a theory that you want to explore and see if you're right when it comes to deductive approach, or you could start with the data and infer and induce a theory, but that is way more complex. And I think that in our field, it's mostly like you do your qualitative research, you read the literature, you design what you think is an interpretation of reality, and then you look at the data and how they combine to give you an answer. You could do that with obviously gender approach, or to an approach to the gender aspect in urban and spatial areas. So let's assume, for example, you could assume that it's difficult on the spot to design a model that does that. But what I'm trying to say is that data is a problem. You could always find proxy for the data you need. But I would say that that is the major obstacle, because the obstacle of the conceptualization is only limited by your creativity in designing the model itself, and making the GIS work for what you need to do. It's a series of tools, really. You combine them to get the answer you want, but you need to design the model before. I'm not sure if I've been clear.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's sort of linked to that other question about the extent that this type of modelling can be used to sort of raise awareness and focus discussion. And I think it's that focusing of discussion that's important. So if it helps to make the issue more graphically apparent to people and enables them to look at different options, I think that's useful. What's really useful is if they do that and you then get real engagement of people with different, as you say, people whose vulnerability is affected by gender or whatever, or age or whatever it is, get them engaged, and then really start to gather that information and have that conversation within communities. And the model then is something that enables the conversation as well as providing a technical base for subsequent decision making. It's where those things come together that it really starts to become powerful, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks a lot. Otis, would you like to make a contribution to that as well, in terms of if you captured any gender information as part of your normal surveys and the socioeconomic descriptions that you would be using for your informal sector communities?
Certainly so. When we conduct our socioeconomic surveys here at the ministry with responsibility for housing, first I must point out that the purpose of these surveys is to inform regularization of squatter settlements and also relocation where necessary. When we are doing these surveys and collecting socioeconomic data, we try as much as possible to disaggregate the data based on gender, collect it based on gender, right? And disaggregate it based on gender also, and present it on this basis because we realize that different persons have different need, and your female needs may vary a little as compared to the needs of males. And also many of these households that we survey are sometimes female-headed households, and the needs within these households may differ because sometimes the income level may differ, and hence their ability to afford whatever solutions we are placing on the market, because we at first aim to allow them to pay for the solutions. So if it is regularization, they'd have been living on the property before, and they just need access to the land through formal means. They own the houses pretty much. So the affordability is always an issue, and females sometimes are unable to afford the solutions being proposed when compared to males, based on population dynamics. Because some study that we did some years ago revealed in 2009 revealed that males earn more than females. I'm not sure what the exact percentage was, but males earn more than females. That study was done by the University of Technology / Salisis, which is based at the University of West Indies, Mona. So we always try to capture gender issues within our studies. And it is also becoming more significant on the international level. We are presently even doing a gender proofing of the national housing policy at this moment. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot. Are there any further questions from the floor? Okay, I know we're cutting into lunchtime a bit, but I just wanted to make sure that we could have covered this subject as thoroughly as possible. I would like to thank our panelists today, Otis, Simone, and Steve, for their presentations on this interesting topic. I think that the two approaches used have been clear demonstrations of how you can establish and capture data in two different formats, but of significant relevance, especially depending upon the environment that you're working in. And more importantly, the application of those tools will be of use into the future. I'd like to thank them again for participating, and thank you all for paying attention along the way. And at this point, I would like to break so that we can go to lunch. Thanks a lot.